A very good morning to all of you. Today we are going to start with our unit number 2 of your literary criticism and theory. In this unit, we are going to first of all understand what neoclassical criticism is, and then we shall go ahead with two critics. One is Apra Ben and the other one is Dr. Samuel Johnson. So in this part of my lecture, I shall be talking about the background to this particular school of criticism, that is neoclassical criticism. So firstly, I shall talk about the origin of the term neoclassicism, and then we shall talk about the uh, neoclassical criticism as a movement. So the term neoclassicism refers to a very broad tendency in literature and art, which started in the early 17th century and lasted until roughly we can say 1750. Of course, officially Romanticism started in with the publication of lyrical ballads. So certain critics think that up to that period it was neoclassicism only. But the rough period is from 1660 to 1750. So that is the period of neoclassicism in literature and art. Now, what does it mean? So you are familiar with the word Renaissance during Elizabethan period. Renaissance means the revival of learning, new learning. But even in the neoclassical criticism, or sorry, a neoclassical period can be considered as the period of the Renaissance itself, because kind of learning was taking place in Europe and especially in Britain. During this neoclassical period, what the writers, poets, and critics did was to revive their learning of Greek and Roman literature. So during this period, ancient works were considered the models for modern greatness. They started following the ancient classical writers and their works. So the neoclassical period is also called the Enlightenment period. Enlightenment means a kind of awareness. So due to increased awareness for logic and a kind of dislike for superstition, this particular period is known as the Enlightenment period also, because there was an awareness for logic. People started thinking logically, and there was a hatred, a disdain for superstition. When we talk about neoclassicism as a literary movement in the context of literature, because neoclassicism is not restricted to only literature, it is applicable to any other form of art, let's say poetry, sculpture, etc. But we are talking in the context of literature. So as a literary movement, neoclassicism, as I mentioned earlier, started in the year 1660 roughly, and believed to have continued up to 1798. So this period, this literary movement was inspired by the rediscovery of classical works of ancient Greece and Rome. They started reading ancient Greek and Roman literature, classical literature. And this classical literature emphasized balance, restraint, and order. So these are some of the features of classical literature, and these rules were followed by the neoclassicists. They started following the ancients. So follow the ancients was their cash line. And neoclassicism, roughly coincided with the Enlightenment period. During that period itself, Enlightenment was going on. In India as well, you might be knowing after the arrival of the Britishers, the Enlightenment period started with Rajaram Mohan Roy, then Mahatma Phule, etc. So this kind of enlightenment was going on during this period itself. Therefore, the people of this period, the artists, the writers, gave importance to reasoning, logical thinking over passion. Passions are strong emotions. So they gave preference to reason, logical thinking, rationality, and they did not give priority to passion or strong emotions, personal feelings, etc. And the notable neoclassical writers of this period include Edmund Burke, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift. These are some of the notable neoclassical writers. You must be knowing something about Alexander Pope's An Essay on Criticism. So Pope's An Essay on Criticism which was published by Pope in the year 1711 anonymously. Anonymously means he hadn't mentioned his name initially. The name of the author was not mentioned. He had published this essay without mentioning his name in the year 1711. And an essay on criticism is considered to be the clearest statement of neoclassical principles in any language. Let's say French language or German, etc. Neoclassicism was going on across the continent. And Pope's An Essay on Criticism is considered to be the clearest statement of neoclassical principles, just like Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. You might be knowing Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads is considered to be the manifesto of Romanticism. In the same manner, Pope's An Essay on Criticism is considered to be the clearest statement of neoclassical principles. So neoclassicism dominated English literature from the Restoration period in 1660. Must be knowing something about the Restoration period in English history, in British history. So Charles II was restored. I cannot go into details of the history of literature. So I rather suggest you to study all these things with reference to your paper 1. In your paper 1, which is titled as British Literature or English Literature from 1550 to 1798, this history is covered. So while reading this history, while learning the history, I suggest you to understand the restoration period, etc. So this neoclassicism dominated English literature from the Restoration in 1660 until the end of the 18th century. That is when the publication of lyrical ballads took place. Means lyrical ballads was published in the year 1798. You might be knowing that lyrical ballads was the joint publication, joint work by Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, and his close friend S.T. Coleridge. And that was the emergence of Romanticism. Of course, before that as well, William Blake, was writing in that way. William Blake is considered to be the Romanticist writers. But the full-fledged emergence of Romanticism is believed to have come into force after the publication of lyrical ballads. Apart from that, we can understand that Boileau's L'Art Prodigue. Boileau was the French critic, French neoclassicist. Boileau's Love, Art, Poetic, and Pope's essay on criticism, as I stated earlier, are considered critical statements of neoclassical principles. Now, what are these principles? These principles consist of or refer to a group of attitudes towards art and human existence. Okay, so these talk about the ideals of order, logic, restraint, accuracy, correctness, restraint, decorum is behavior, and so on. The taste for something. Now, these principles talk about the ideals of order, means how the poem should be written, how a work of art should be presented. Logic, they just talked about logic. Then restraints means follow of the means actually following the rules strictly. Then they insisted on accuracy, correctness, etc. We are going to talk about these features in the next part of my discussion. So these principles refer to all these things. And the practitioners, the one who followed neoclassicism, the practitioners of various arts were made to imitate or reproduce the structure and themes of Greek or Roman origins. Means they were suggested by the poets, writers, artists were made to imitate, follow the Greek and Roman classical writers. So neoclassicism comprised a return to the classical models, we can say. They followed the classical models, literary styles, and values of ancient Greek and Roman authors. So this is what we understand about the term neoclassicism. In the next part of my discussion, I shall be talking about the features of neoclassicism.